If you've ever been to downtown Portland, Oregon, in particular in this case, Southwest 1st and Oak Street, you might notice there's some of the oldest, most historic buildings to be found in the city in that area. But in particular, there is a one-story brick building that if you've ever walked by it and looked up towards the top of the roof line, you might notice in little blue letters you'll see spelled out the name Freimann, which is in reference to a man who was born Bernhard Freimann. Sorry. I've walked past this place several times. Saw the name there, figured, okay, former name of a restaurant that used to be there. Never really gave it that much thought beyond like, okay, that's probably the name of someone who ran a restaurant in this old building once upon a time. It just never really got my attention. And then by chance, like a lot of things I cover, that's how it starts, stumbling onto something by chance, I found an article from October of 1933 that was discussing the life of a man who was born Bernhard Freimann. Now, I keep saying born because he later started going by a more American-sounding name that was very much in line with the name he was born with. What's interesting is his name sounds like Freiman, but he didn't go by Freiman. He went by the name Freeman. In this article I stumbled onto from 1933, I didn't get two full paragraphs in before I discovered that Bernhard Freimann wrote a book that was published that same year, 1933, just a short while after his death. And that book was called Freeman of Stamboul, and it was written by Bernard Freeman. That was the name that he went by at some point along the way in his life. I'm assuming probably around the time he came to America, or somewhere along those lines. This book is nuts, and it's going to be the primary source for what I'm going to talk about here in this video. And I'm going to tell you here, right now, in no way, shape, or form do I believe 100% of what is written in this book. I'm not even certain I believe 50% of it. But when I first discovered that the man who owned this random restaurant in downtown Portland for a time, more than 100 years ago, when I discovered that this man apparently had this very elaborate life outside of Portland, I thought maybe there's something there to research. And I gathered me up a few newspaper articles, and when all is said and done, I barely even used any of that stuff because the book he wrote became my primary source for the story of a man who, by his own account, led a life very similar to the likes of Forrest Gump. If there was a place to be, this guy was there. And if there was a wild event to happen, he was not just there, but he was also part of it. This is the story of, I'm just going to use this version of his name, Bernard Freeman, and his life story in his own words from the 1933 book, Freeman of Stamboul. Now, as I read this book, I never really fully understood the title until I actually said it out loud. Freeman of Stamboul. It sounds like Freeman Istanbul, which makes sense because Bernard Freeman was born in Constantinople, which later would have its name changed to Istanbul, located in Turkey. That is where he was born by his own account, because this is a major thing with Mr. Freeman's work, is getting dates right. By his own account in the book, he says that he was born in 1852. Now, he died October 2nd, 1933. So this would mean he was either 80 years old, almost 81 when he died, or he was 81 years old. But his gravestone in Australia states clearly that he was 82 when he died. And sources, including findagrave.com, list him as being born in 1851, which syncs up more to if he was 82 years old when he died in 1933. So, this guy maybe even got his own birth date wrong. And it's important to understand the perspective that this book was written in. This man wrote this book at the end of his life. I don't think he realized how close to the end of his life he was. I think he thought he was going to live to see this work published. And he actually died shortly before it was published. This was a man who was 81 years old when he wrote this account. So when I discuss getting dates wrong, a lot of that may just be he's older. Based on how he wrote, I don't think he had any cognitive issues. I don't think he was having any severe memory issues, things that might validate inaccuracies in a person's work. At that point in life, you're reflecting back on a lot of old stories, and some of them you may not remember the way that they actually happened. But more so in this case, I think this was a man who had lived an intriguing life. I believe a lot of what happened in this book in terms of where he was, because you can validate that he was in all of these places. But this is a story written by a man who, every person of significance he ran into, that person fell in love with him. He claimed to have met numerous famous people who, after a short while, these people determined that Bernard Freeman was like the greatest man in the world. So there's a lot of ego in what is written here. And there's also a lot of extensive, detailed, 3 to 4 page long conversations that are written word for word in this book that you and I both know could not possibly be 100% accurate. Going into this story, I really didn't know what was going to come. I was just completely shocked that this guy, who I thought I might find a little information outside of his time in Portland and maybe be able to do a little video, little did I realize he was going to have such a wild, extravagant life that even if his book is a little bit exaggerated, this guy still saw a lot of things in his life. And so as I tell his story, I'm going to try to discuss it from the perspective of this is what he said happened, because so much of this story I have a hard time believing, and there's certain aspects that I actively can say either he got dates wrong or he's just flat out wrong in his information. And anybody who's read his book, pretty much everybody acknowledges the fact that most of what he says happened in this book has not and or cannot be verified. This is an account written by a man at the end of his life, and most of what he discusses happens prior to 1900. So even by the time he wrote this, it's been more than 30 years since most of these events happened, and a lot of people he discusses meeting in that time. By 1933, we're all dead and gone. So Bernard Freeman is born 1852 in Constantinople, and he describes his childhood as being fairly average, but even as a young child, he had a tendency towards mischief. And his mother, who he had a very strong bond with, unfortunately passed away when he was very young, and so he was primarily raised by his father during those early years. And his description of his relationship with his father was definitely that of a father-son dynamic where there was some strain. Bernard would frequently get in trouble, cause mischief, and his dad would give him a lashing for it. And he actually developed a stronger connection with his uncle than his father. He would, when there was trouble, he would kind of run to his uncle and try to get some help. And one of the primary reasons he would do that, he would say out loud, "I've come to you because I do not want to go to my father." And it seems like with the passage of time, even still as a young man, not even an adult yet, he ultimately got to the point where he didn't want to associate with his father anymore. Right out of the gate, this is a crazy, crazy life story. And you can hear it, and a skeptic in particular is going to sit here and just be like, "Oh my God, Steve, why are you even talking about this? No way any of this is true." But that's what makes it so fascinating, is we really can't say for certain what is accurate and what isn't. And obviously, in terms of history, the stuff I'm most qualified to comment on is that stuff which happened in Portland. Because yes, this young man from Constantinople spent off and on almost 20 years of his life in the Portland area. He wrote back to it frequently when he was gone, and he always referred to it as his second home. Second home to what exactly? I'm not certain. And this goes back to him being a child. And when I mean a child, I'm not talking about a 12, 13, 14-year-old. I'm talking about a kid who was not even 10 yet. And when his father took him out of an English school, as he described it, that was when he started causing more trouble. And when there was continued friction between him and his father, Bernard ran off and hit the road with a traveling gypsy group. And mind you, I don't know exactly how old he was, but based on where he tells this story at, he had to be like 8 when he just ran away from home and traveled with this gypsy group for a while. And apparently, one of the girls, I'm not certain how old she was, but it's inferred that she was definitely older than him, took a liking to him. Now, to what extent that liking was, I'm not certain, but there was enough there that this girl's boyfriend went after Mr. Freeman with a knife and was like, "I'm going to kill you because you're trying to steal my woman." And after that event, Bernard Freeman realized pretty quick maybe this isn't where he should be as a young child. And so he went back home, but not for long. His sister, who at least provided some stability in that household, at least with Bernard and his father and his sister there was, I don't know, a little bit more stability than when it went down to just Bernard and his father, because his sister married a man and left to Alexandria, Egypt. It was even said later on by Bernard Freeman's first wife, as far as I know, she claimed that he was born in Alexandria, Egypt, which is not accurate. But when he was about 10 years old, he fled home, took stowage on a boat, and went down to Alexandria to try to start a new life with his sister. And the moment he shows up, his sister's husband is enraged. He already knows about this boy, and he's like, "No, no, 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 kid, you are nothing but trouble." And Bernard's like, "Please, I don't want to go home and live with my dad. I'm just this innocent little 10-year-old boy, please." And so I guess you could say he's kind of given this trial run. Let's see if you can live here and not get in trouble. And immediately he gets into trouble. His, I guess, brother-in-law at this point is pissed, forces him to leave. "You got to go back home and be with your dad." And he doesn't want to go back, but he's forced to. And he's barely back home in Constantinople with his father before he turns right around and comes right back to Egypt. There's this kind of back and forth thing. And I gotta say, regardless of how accurate or inaccurate this story is, you really get a feeling, because this is mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s, that a lot of his story takes place. And you really get a reminder from the perspective of someone who's living in 2025, how long it took to travel. And how much of people's lives, especially if they were traveling a lot or they were going on long trips to faraway destinations, the like years that some people spent their lives, and I'm not talking about people who worked on boats or people who were in the Navy and spent a lot of time on boats. I'm talking about people who lived just regular lives, who still spent years out of their life just traveling to various places. I know it's obvious, considering the capabilities people had towards traveling back then, but still, when you really stop to think about it, it's really quite remarkable. And so this back and forth that's going on between Constantinople and Egypt goes on over the course of a couple of years. In addition to Bernard's brother-in-law and his own father both getting sick of him even being around, his uncle is also getting sick of dealing with him, because every time he gets in trouble, he comes running to his uncle, and his uncle has to help him. So in 1866, again by Bernard's timeline, his uncle is like, all right, I'm going to do you this favor, and this is like the last time I'm helping you. And so he got Bernard, he's only, about 14 years old at this time. He got him into another English-speaking school. This one was in Jerusalem. And so he first really discovered religion there because it was a religious school. He really had no previous religious affiliation or religious interest as a child growing up. And the attitude was, and he said this himself to his father, he had previously gone to an English school when he was younger, and it wasn't until his dad forcibly removed him that he started becoming a troublemaker. So even he was begging, get me back into an English school, some school of some kind, and that will probably help me become less of a troublemaker. And that's what's so wild, is so much of his early days, mostly prior to being in Jerusalem, he was just this kid running around with the wrong crowd, committing crimes, and even when he didn't mean to cause trouble, he would. So he spent a very life-altering period in Jerusalem, getting his education and trying to find, at least, greater stability in his life. And one of the things he was ultimately able to find steady work doing, again, he's still a teenager here, he found work as a British interpreter. And one of the reasons he was able to find work as an interpreter is because, and this was in his family lineage, they were all masters of language. They pretty much all spoke several languages. And even as a small child, Bernard Freeman spoke 8 different languages, and he would say as an adult he spoke 12. So he made a lot of sense in terms of someone you might want to seek out to do interpreter kind of work. But he was getting kind of restless, and he was looking for something new. And that's the kind of thing. I feel like this is a man who was, again, by his own account, always looking for something new to pursue. But he's still young, he's still naive, and he decides to pursue the life of a man at sea. And for a couple of years, that's mostly what he was doing. He was traveling around and seeing other exotic destinations. He had his first landing in Australia, a place that would have significant effect on his life, off and on. And that was when he made his first landing there. And ultimately, he was part of a long trek west to the West Indies, where he tells a story that is very Forrest Gump and Lieutenant Dan, about him being stuck in a storm, and he's still not really well trained in terms of how to control a boat, and they're in this massive storm. And this is circa 1870, so he's still only like 16 years old. And he claims that he was, stuck in this massive storm with his friend Charlie, and he somehow managed to navigate this boat through this storm and got back to where he needed to be. And by the time he finally made it there, he realized his friend Charlie was gone. And all he could presume was that amidst, the struggle and the waves crashing against the boat, Charlie must have gone overboard. And this is not the only time that Bernard Freeman told a story about being stuck out at sea under circumstances where even a skilled man of the sea would have probably lost their life. But somehow he pulled through. He always had the objective, even at this time, he ultimately wanted to make it to the west coast of America. And even by this time, the establishment of gold in California was a long standing thing. It was almost an old story by this time. And towns were beginning to blossom and grow rapidly out west. Places like Portland, Oregon, which was steadily growing into the 1870s. And Bernard Freeman didn't just want to get to America at some point, he wanted to get to the West Coast. However, his first landing in America was actually in New York, and he discusses spending a short period in New York City and said he was miserable, said it was horrible, it was one of the worst times in his life. The people he had to associate with, he said that he had to evade attacks and robberies all the time. He called New York City the place where like all of the scum of the world just come together to congregate. He was not a fan of New York City. And from there he was eventually back at sea, and he obviously at some point would have gone down and around South America and back up to get to the west side of America. That's how you had to do it prior to the Panama Canal being constructed. And he finally came ashore on the West Coast in San Francisco in 1874. And this is where we get another one of these interesting stories. Because once they landed at San Francisco, Freeman was on a contract. It was like a 2-year contract, essentially. I don't know if contract is the word they would use, but he was under an agreement for 2 years to be on this boat. And those 2 years were not anywhere near being done. But once they landed in San Francisco, Bernard Freeman had every intention of staying there and not leaving. But after landing there in San Francisco, they arrived there by his own account on April 1st, 1874. And they stay there for a while. They stay there just long enough for Freeman to make a few friends. And he confides in them, I don't want to leave. But the captain of my ship isn't exactly going to just let me stay here. And his friends say, don't worry, we're going to get Jim Turk involved. And Jim Turk is described as this tall, hulking man who was involved in all sorts of vice and crime in the area. And he'd gotten into a fight once and someone had slashed his face, so he had this massive scar on his face. And Freeman and Turk, start bonding and connecting. And Turk is like, don't worry, we're going to take care of this. And so Freeman goes back to his ship to tell his captain, I'm not leaving with you. And the captain says, like hell. And that's when Jim Turk shows up and is like, listen, you're going to pay this man what he's earned. You don't have to pay him everything because he didn't finish his whole tour with you, but pay him what he's earned. And the guy's like, the hell with that. And they're not really getting anywhere. Jim Turk is a scary looking guy, but this captain is not going to let one of his best men go. And so this fight's ongoing and it's not really getting resolved, and it's kind of uncertain how things are going to end. And then the captain's wife, who's on board the boat, she's probably been listening to them arguing. She comes storming out of, I guess, her room, wherever she was, storms up to her husband and expresses her disgust in his conduct and says, this young man wants to leave and you will let him leave. And the captain, what can you do? What can you say? So he said, fine, I'm only going to pay you this much and I guess you can go. And thanks to that captain's wife, Bernard Freeman was allowed to stay in San Francisco. But he didn't stay there long. He had the intention of going up to Oregon. And he settled first in Portland. And he described Portland of 1874, even though in another letter he would say he arrived in 1872. So in this case, Sometime in late 1874, he first arrives in Portland. Whereas, again, in a letter he wrote years before 1933, he says that he came to Portland in 1872. And he claimed his description of Portland is very much like what it was in the 1850s. It still was to some degree in the 1870s, but he describes it as a one-horse town where there was still like stumps sticking out of the middle of the street. His description of Portland it's not super representative of where it was at by the mid 1870s. It had already developed into a well-respected town by the time of the 1873 fire that almost destroyed the whole city. And I would think if Bernard Freeman came to Portland in 1872 and he was here to experience that fire, it certainly would have shown up in his book, because he made a point of discussing the floods that came to town later, and we'll get to that because there's some inconsistency there as well. But in his book, he says he came in late 1874, and if he arrived in San Francisco in April 1874 and stayed there a bit, that does line up. But what doesn't line up is what he at least infers happened just after his arrival in town, because he made a point of mentioning that Portland as a city, there was a lot of thugs and thieves running around, which was true, especially in the earlier years of Portland. They were everywhere. And he discusses being, shortly after his arrival, walking down the street and being knocked down by two men who were fleeing a jewelry store that they had just robbed, and that these men were known as Brown and Johnson. Those were the men's last names. Well, the story that he is telling here, and he adds later on that the police were chasing them, there was a bit of a shootout, and one of the bullets these thieves fired struck a young boy that he referenced as being named Joseph. This young man was named Louis Joseph. This was a well-known 1870s Portland story. However, it didn't happen in 1874. It happened in 1878. So it did not happen right after Bernard Freeman's arrival in Portland. So again, you have a little more inconsistency in terms of what is supposed to have happened when. But again, Bernard Freeman's story is so fascinating that I have to tell it here. And you can decide for yourselves which parts you believe and which parts you don't. You may take all of it hook, line, and sinker. You may think not one word of it is believable. But I mean, at least some of the Portland stuff is verified as far as I've been able to determine. But I actually covered the Louis Joseph shooting in a Historic Murders of Portland episode that I actually never aired. I forgot that I even edited it and never posted it. But in the case of Bernard Freeman, this is a common thread in his book, is that if there was a big event going on, and the shooting of Louis Joseph in 1878, that was one of the biggest stories to come out of late 1870s Portland, where there was a big story or a big event happening, and Freeman was in the state or country, he was right there in the middle of it. Now, while he arrived in Portland, he didn't stay long, couldn't really find any work. And so he traveled out west and settled for a period in the Dalles. And during that time, he ultimately obtained work as a stagecoach manager. And his job was to overlook at least this was part of his job, was overlooking the construction of stations to be erected. And he was sent out to middle of nowhere, Central Oregon. And he was out there to pretty much get the area prepped and ready, or at least at the point of getting ready to do something when you're not actually doing much yet. And so he settled in this area, had space to set up a camp, he had some food with him, and these other workers that were going to produce the station out there, they were going to come out there and meet up with him later. He was going ahead to get things settled. And people had warned him against this type of activity, going out to the rurals of Oregon without much protection, because as it was described then, the Native Americans in the area, they were on a tear. and they were attacking pretty much any white man that they came upon. Now, of course, this is how it's conveyed in his book. So while Bernard Freeman is out there waiting for this crew to show up and for this work to begin, he can hear sounds in the distance. He knows the natives are near. And it seems like they just keep getting closer and closer and closer, and the days are going by. And suddenly Bernard Freeman starts to realize this crew that was supposed to be coming to help him do this work, they're not coming. He's out there alone. He just said that there was one other man who kind of lived in the area that he would go visit with, and that was the only other person around, at least person who wasn't a Native American. And they're getting too close, and he doesn't know what's going to happen, but he assumes if he is seen, he's probably in a lot of trouble. So he does the best he can to wreck the little setup he's made there for himself. He doesn't want to leave any indication that somebody was there. And he packs up what he can, and he then claims that he finds a old burned out tree, and he's able to slip inside of there with what little food and provisions he has, and he stayed there for several weeks, hiding out in this burned out tree, this hollowed out space within the tree. Spent weeks there on his own, living off what little food he had. He had some like corned beef and some bread, and he just lived off of what he had. And he would sneak out in the middle of the night and go down to the nearest river to get water. And even that he felt was risky, and he told a story of at one moment he was inside his tree and he could literally hear the natives circling around it. Like if he made a peep, bumped anything, he was going to be found. But the thing is, it's abundantly clear nobody's coming to save him. He is out there alone. And he can't survive much longer just hiding out in this hollow tree, especially with his food running out. Eventually, he's gonna have to take a chance. And one day he sees what appears to be a militia vehicle carrying men that appear to be white, and he thinks, okay, maybe there's like a camp or something nearby. And he says, well, this is my chance, and he takes off and runs for it. And he ultimately tracks down this camp and claims that he gets there by the skin of his teeth. The natives are just right behind him. And he manages to make it to this camp and evade getting attacked. And the people at the camp are shocked. They're astonished that he made it that far without getting attacked. So then, of course, we, in hindsight, have to wonder, is that exactly how things went down? I don't know. But that is his story. And under the protection of the people at this camp, he was able to get a ride back to the Dalles, arrive there safe and sound. Stound. I don't know what that means. And the next thing he went into briefly, he had his first stint in the hotel business, which is a business he would get into once he settled in Portland. He even claimed that when Henry Villard, who was a rich railroad man and was behind the construction of the building that would be abandoned, and later the construction would be resumed and that would become the Portland Hotel, Bernard Freeman in his book claimed that he was set to become the manager of that hotel when it was done. But while construction began in the early 1800s, it wouldn't be completed and opened until 1890, so it seems that never happened. Whether or not he was actually in line to become the manager, I don't know. He was a well-respected hotel man in Portland, though, so maybe that is factual. But he briefly took on running a hotel in the Dalles, and pretty much he took it on because the guy who owned it said there was so many ruffians in town and so many people causing problems at that hotel constantly. He needed someone that he knew was tough and could hack it. And he figured, Bernard Freeman, you're the man for the job. And he took on that job for a while, and even after a while, he kind of got fed up dealing with the riffraff. And he was ready to move on to his next adventure. And one issue in this book is there's extensive periods where he doesn't even give the year that things are happening, so we kind of have to approximate. And he ran this hotel in the Dalles for about 2 years before he left and then went to Astoria on the coast, which is a place known for having a successful fishing and canning industry. And he wanted to get in on that. So if I had to approximate when he left the Dalles for Astoria, it would have been around 1877, 1878 is when he claims to have gone over to Astoria. And everything went south very quickly. He had to invest pretty much all of his money into just getting what they needed to run this business, which included having several boats. Again, we're getting into this Forrest Gump territory, except he wasn't really after shrimp. They were after fish, but I mean seafood. And he has another Forrest Gump, Lieutenant Dan-like experience. He ends up getting washed out into the ocean in the middle of this storm, and it's another one of these stories where he probably should have just been sucked out there and died. But somehow he managed to steer the ship through these tough waters, and he survived the ordeal. But the ship he was on, one of their main ones, was wrecked. Other boats they had were wrecked, and they just couldn't go on. So his ventures in Astoria ended very quickly because he invested just about everything he had into that, so he didn't really have a lot of money to deal with issues that came along later, like all of your boats getting wrecked. And that was the thing about Bernard Freeman, sorry, there's going to be crossover to Freimann, which was his, actual name. Sorry, that's going to happen from time to time, but he even admits that when he was financially successful, once he made that money, the next thing he wanted to do was he wanted to find some other exotic destination to go to, and that would be pretty much where he spent his money. So a lot of his life was wrapped up in making a bunch of money and losing all of it, or spending all of it, but running out of money. Making money, running out of money. Making money, running out of money. That was a reoccurring theme in his life. And after the Astoria thing didn't quite work out, he made his way back to Portland. And upon his arrival in Portland, he finds work in a bakery. And he starts getting a little bit more into the kind of restaurant business for the first time in his life. And this is around 1878, which is critical in terms of what he would do later on. And he moved around between a few different businesses, and one of the places he worked at felt like he wasn't getting paid enough, and the boss didn't really care, so he moved on to the next place. And he started working at the Vienna Cafe for a man named Wolf, who he acknowledged as a man whose heart wasn't really in the business. And ultimately, Freeman was able to buy him out. And that was how he had his first, it was a cafe, but really his first restaurant type establishment. Remember what I discussed at the very beginning of this video. And he's finding he has a knack in this restaurant cafe type game. And he starts buying other establishments around town and even buys his first hotel in Portland. And he's starting to have more financial success. But it's not quite enough. And that is where we get into 1881. And Bernard Freeman almost kind of taking credit for the initial boom in the town that was formerly known as Albina. Or, I understand, it was named after the wife of the man who owned the land, and her name was pronounced Albina, but over the years, it has been referred to more often as Albina. Many people have lived in the area since then. It's historically more regarded as Albina, and that is why I use that way of saying it in a video where I'm trying to remember how people's names are pronounced, because later on we're going to have a little comparison between two names that are only different by one letter, but there's actually some interesting connections between Bernard Freeman, Bernhard Freimann, and another person who had a similar last name with connections to Portland, but we'll get to that. But before he starts taking an interest in land on the east side of the river from the area that's now downtown Portland, the area that was Albina, he briefly travels to visit a friend in Salt Lake City, Utah, and based on the name of the chapter alone, he almost became a Mormon. His friend had become part of the Mormon church, and him and a lot of people, they were really pressuring him to become involved because apparently he was so worldly, he'd had all these experiences, and even by this time, he's only like 24 years old, and they really wanted him. And he was taking some interest. He still really didn't have that much of a robust history in terms of being a religious man outside of getting educated in Jerusalem. And the moment that he, let's just say, started getting the ick with the whole thing was when these two young women were presented to them, women he didn't even know, and they were asked, would you marry Mr. Freeman? And they immediately and excitedly were like, yes, yes, absolutely. And Bernard Freeman started realizing there's something a little off about this. And his interest began waning very quickly. And he made his way back to Portland, not a Mormon. But he, by his own account, he said he knew a bridge was coming soon. Eventually a bridge would be built connecting the east side and the west side being where Portland was up until 1891, when East Portland and Albina on the east side were annexed in, and it all became one city. And he was right. Granted, he was writing from a 1933 perspective because just a few years down the road in 1887, the first Morrison Bridge would be built, the first pedestrian and traffic bridge crossing the Willamette River. And Freeman claims that he knew that bridge was coming, and when it did, some of that east side property right by the river, the value of it was going to explode. And he wanted to get his hands on this property. And he starts sweet-talking some property owners in the area. But he knows he can't financially cover it all on his own. So he starts bringing in some other people. And he has this meeting in one of his hotels. And he's telling them, you guys all want to get invested. We're going to buy up this property. And, a short time from now, it's going to be 5, 10, 20 times the value that it is right now. Especially once that bridge comes. You guys want to get involved with me. And, these people are a little interested, but they would have had to invest thousands of dollars. And this is the early 1880s. $1,000 alone is a huge amount of money. So Freeman realizes he's got to up the stakes a bit. So he tells them about the prominent men about town that have already taken an interest and have invested in this thing. He tells them, William S. Ladd, who I've discussed many times, a prominent man about Portland, probably the most prominent banker in Portland at this time. He's invested. Henry Failing has invested, another banker in Portland, a man who has already served multiple terms as the city's mayor, another well-respected man. Harvey Whitefield Scott has invested in this, one of the most prominent Portlanders, the guy who ran the Oregonian and wrote the first detailed history of Portland. These men have already invested in this. So trust me, guys, this is on the up and up and you want to get invested. And these guys say, oh, well, damn, that changes everything. And these men start investing in this thing. But the thing is, even by Bernard Freeman's own account in his book, none of these men had invested yet. So after he has this meeting, he goes and meets with William S. Ladd and says, hey, I'm doing this land deal and I want you to be invested. Ladd also owns some farmland right in this area. And he claims that, right after they meet, William S. Ladd's like, I can tell you're a smart guy. And you know what? I'll get invested and I'll even let you have that farmland. Okay. And then he goes on to meet with Henry Failing. And Henry Failing's interested. He's a little perturbed because he's still a banker. And he's a little annoyed that Freeman went to Ladd, a competitive banker, first, but he agrees to be involved. So then he goes and meets Harvey Whitefield Scott, who is very resistant to the whole thing. He's very suspicious of it. He says, this just sounds like it's just some kind of goofy land scheme. And Freeman does his best to convince him that this is on the up and up and you're going to make a boatload of money out of this. He also promises to advertise a lot in Scott's Oregonian. And he schmoozes him and gets him to invest. So these three guys apparently did get invested in this whole thing, but not before Freeman had this meeting with these guys where he said these men were already invested. And so he gets all of this land, and the objective is to get it and to sell it at a markup. That's how all these parties involved were going to make their money. And it's moving kind of slow, and things aren't going that well. And again, this is all from the perspective of Bernard Freeman. He claims that he hires a bunch of workers to come out and start work in preparing a railroad line to come through there. Now, he would claim that he was good friends with Ben Holliday, another prominent early Portland businessman who was instrumental in getting the railroad in Portland, and he ran a railroad line through the east side near here. Just adding that to the dynamic. And so Freeman brings these people in to start preparing a railroad line to be run through there, and that's going to really bring in people to buy land. Once the railroad's there, it changes everything. And he had surveyors out there checking the land, and people were like, whoa, what's going on? And people start asking around. And all these people working there are saying, well, we've been sworn to secrecy about what's going on. And so everyone's excited. They're keeping mum about it, but the railroad's coming. And all of a sudden, all these people start flying in, wanting to buy land in the area. And according to Bernard Freeman, this was all a ruse. He brought all these people in to make it look like he was going to run a railroad line through there without any intention of actually doing it. Sure, a railroad line would run through there at some point, but in terms of right there, right now, it was a farce. He wanted to make it look like this was happening by having all these workers out here doing stuff that looked like they were preparing for it and also keeping quiet about it so that nobody would find out that this was all fake. And the land just started selling like crazy. And ultimately, according to Bernard Freeman, everybody, I don't know if they got rich off of it, but everybody made pretty good money off of this land. Now, that all seems a bit strange to me. You would think it would have been realized pretty quickly, at least eventually, that this was all a scam, and you'd think people who came in and people that came in and bought property would realize after a while, oh, this railroad line's not happening, I've been schemed, and there would be a lot of blowback, and I found no reference to that in Freeman's book. So it's a little hard to believe. And it seems like somebody trying to create the impression that he was capable of just about anything, and no matter how rough things got, he always knew a way out. But that is what he says happened in terms of this big land scheme that people made a lot of money off of in early 1800s Portland. Now, Albina did experience some growth, in particular in the late 1880s, but a lot of the land that was near the river, the land that, based on description alone, seems to be the land where Freeman was buying it, a lot of that became industrial. And obviously the Albina rail yards were run through there eventually. So maybe a lot of the land he was selling was for industrial purposes. And he did discuss a key motivation behind pursuing this project being that a lot of people were emigrating there, and a lot of people did emigrate to Albina during the 1880s and into even the 1890s after it was annexed into Portland. But like a lot of stories Freeman tells, there's nothing to really prove that this actually happened, that this is how he managed to sell off these properties and make a bunch of money. And of course, if this is how Freeman made his money, he had a bunch of money, so of course he's off to another destination. And he goes down to California for a while, and for a period settles in Santa Barbara. Gets involved in the hotel business down there for a while, has some success, blows through a lot of his money, falls in love with a woman named Juanita, who he realized when all was said and done, there was too many differences between them to really have any kind of success in a relationship. And if he did stay with her and possibly marry her, he probably would have had to stay in Santa Barbara, which he expressed in his book he had no plans on doing. So the end of his experience in Santa Barbara before returning to Portland is having to break Juanita's heart. And he puts that out in detail in his book, that she was pissed and livid, and he abandoned her, was how she felt about it. But he made his way back to Portland, and one of the reasons he came back to Portland was he had left his, again, he had a hotel, couple cafes, he had businesses going, and those businesses were having success. But by the time he came back in 1885, he kicked everything up a notch again by establishing Freeman, you could say Freeman's Restaurant, but obviously the way it was written was in his birth name, which would be Freimann. Freiman's Restaurant, which he established in 1885. Some sources have said 1884, but I've literally found advertisements from 1885, and not the start of the year, but late summer, that discuss the opening of this new restaurant. So that building that stands there at First and Oak was erected, at least completed, in 1885. Again, historically speaking, people have said that building was built in 1884. Some have said 1885. Some have even said it was erected back in the 1870s, which is just flat out inaccurate, unless he built a completely new place using pieces of the building that was formerly there. Now, there had been a saloon there previously, and having a saloon was a key part of Freimann's new establishment here. In fact, it got him into some hot water. See, while not being a super religious man, he had become more and more invested in his religion over time, and being as prominent as he was in Portland, he was prominent in the church. And in establishing this restaurant and having a saloon, he was serving alcohol, a big no-no for the church. So the church shows up. His place is just opened, it's barely going, and they say, you need to stop serving alcohol. This is evil. Don't side with Satan over the church and keep serving people alcohol. Freeman doesn't want to let the church down. The church had a lot of influence in Portland. He certainly didn't want to have them up against him. But the problem was, he came back from Santa Barbara broke, because he went there to spend his money in the first place. And now he was in pretty solid debt to liquor dealers who were providing him his alcohol for his establishment. And if he couldn't run his business and serve their alcohol and pay these men off, he was ruined. It was pretty much not an option for him financially. So he tells a story of being in his hotel, and members of the church show up, and in front of all the guests in the lobby say, "Come with us, Mr. Freeman, you need to come to our church. You're going to lead us in prayer." So what can he do? He goes with them to the church, leads them in prayer, makes a statement, and he's still teetering, because he knows he's ruined if he stops serving this alcohol. But he loves the church and doesn't want to disappoint them. But in the end, he went with the devil and sided with serving alcohol. And of course the church was angry, but what they weren't counting on was Portland was a city of people who loved their alcohol. They really, 1800s Portlanders loved their alcohol. And Freimann's would become, and I'm just going to call it Freimann's because it's what it says, even though I've been referring to him as Freeman in the story. But Freimann's restaurant becomes arguably the most popular place in town. And that's not even out of his book. He doesn't even really spend that much time talking about his restaurant in his book. But this is from newspaper articles. His place was the place to go. Every week it was listed as one of the restaurants to go eat at this week. And we have another event that, again, as far as the date is concerned, could not be accurate. His restaurant opens in 1885. He claims in 1886 that Sarah Bernhardt comes and visits her restaurant. And she specifically visits there because she was in town to celebrate the opening of the Markham Grand Theater. This is 1886. Markham Grand Theater did not open until 1890. So again, maybe Freeman's just getting his dates wrong by 4 years. Sarah Bernhardt was a French actress, arguably the most famous actress in the world at that time. And she's in Portland at Freiman's restaurant. And she shows up, and everything Freiman prepares for her is fantastic. And he even claims, when all is said and done, when he gave her the dessert, she loved it so much that she pretty much had a meltdown. She started sobbing. She stood up and was just like, "This is magnificent." And she ran into Bernard Freeman's arms, embraced him, and kissed him on both cheeks. Sarah Bernhardt, most famous actress in the world. And apparently, Sylvester Penoyer, who at the time is the governor of Oregon, is also there. I guess probably also there to celebrate the 1890 opening of the Markham Grand. And apparently he yells out, "Freeman, you lucky dog," in response to him getting kissed on the cheek by the, again, most famous actress in the world. Now, did that really happen? I can't prove it didn't, but I certainly question it. But reportedly, after that event, Bernard Freeman got the nickname that stayed with him, even after he left Portland, but it was in specific relation to his restaurant, which was "Leave It to Me, Freeman," or "Leave It to Me, Freiman," which essentially meant when people went to his restaurant and didn't necessarily know what they wanted, he would say, "Leave it to me," and he would figure out the perfect meal to bring to these people. He also usually ended up giving them some of the most expensive things on the menu, so people would sometimes be a little shocked when they got their bill at the end. And apparently years later, during one of his stints in Australia, he got the reputation as being a clairvoyant, among everything else. And part of this was attributed to his reputation as "Leave It to Me, Freiman," always knowing what the customer wanted even when the customer didn't. Little side thing. Now, another individual, now this was not mentioned in his book, but this I rather found in a newspaper article. So maybe it's even more reliable. But apparently, Rudyard Kipling, famous author, was in Portland and he stopped at Freiman's to eat. And it was reported in this newspaper article that he met Ben Freeman. Sorry, I know I'm going back and forth between Freeman and Freiman. They're interchangeable. Accept it. When he met Bernard, I'm pretty sure I've called him Benjamin Freeman a few times too. Sorry. Bernard Freeman. they got so caught up in conversation, in particular because they'd both been to India before, and they got so caught up in conversation that Rudyard Kipling almost missed his train out of town. So that's another story. And again, it's one of these things where they just met and a famous person just fell in love with Bernard Freeman. He notes in his book during the large 1890 flood that hit Portland, which it was a significant flood, completely wrecked his establishment, which made sense. He was at First and Oak. He was only like 2 blocks back from the river. This is before the seawall. He's a little further north in town. His area was a primary spot that would have been drastically affected by any flood that came into town. And again, he was in debt to, in particular, liquor dealers. And because they acknowledged the situation and he had been paying them off to that point, they noted, this guy's screwed. He's broke now. He can't even open his business and make money till it gets fixed up. He's in no position to pay off his debts. They wiped his debt clean and gave him a new line of credit, gave them $5,000 to fix up his establishment and get it going again. And what is so sad is I can't remotely imagine something like that happening today with all of the greed in the world and with the fact that how many people in this country would see something like that and not see it as these fellow men helping this fellow man and not call it a name. I just wish you could still see things like that and see them as being common. But now when someone loses everything, a lot of people are out there to just take advantage of that. But in this case, thanks to goodwill from people that he owed money to, he was able to rebuild. That being said, this is where he becomes a somewhat unreliable narrator again. He claims when a great flood hit Portland in 1892, it ruined his establishment again. It was worse than before, and it was something he could never recover from. And he ultimately decided to leave town afterward. Well, I looked it up, and there was no great flood that hit Portland. He said specifically June 21st, 1892. I looked it up. There was no great Portland flood that hit on that date or even around it. However, there was the Great Portland Flood that hit in 1894. So he claims that he left Portland in 1892, but is referencing a flood that it absolutely has to be referencing the 1894 flood. And this is an issue because he claims he left Portland shortly after and moved to Honolulu, Hawaii, and was there during major events that happened primarily in 1893. But if he left Portland because his place was destroyed in the Great Flood of 1894, then how was he in Hawaii during 1893? And there are even articles from 1893. There were other Freimann restaurants that opened. There was at least 2 more. One of which he expressed, I'm still working my main place down on First and Oak, so I won't be running this other, it was called Freimann's Uptown. And he said, I'm too busy with my other restaurant at First and Oak, so I won't be running that place. These are in newspaper articles from 1893, but he says he left and his place was destroyed in 1892. So either he is an unreliable narrator in terms of what year he actually left, or I think he's just kind of making things up, because we not only have him clearly referencing a flood that happened in 1894, we have newspaper articles that clearly indicate at least into mid to late 1893, he was still in Portland running Freimann's restaurant. And yet he claims that during 1893, he was in Hawaii, experiencing the literal upheaval of the government that happened there. He not only was there when the Queen of Hawaii was overthrown and replaced by a new provisional government, he claims that he was directly involved, that he knew the Queen, that he was there to witness many of the changes. He knew the man, Sanford Dole, who became the president of Hawaii, was chosen in 1893. He claims to have had direct conversations with this man because he was in Hawaii. And yet we have evidence he was in Portland during this time. And what even might add further credence to the idea that Freeman left Portland in 1894 rather than 1892, or even perhaps sometime in 1893, is his place was reopened as a new restaurant in August of 1894. And at that time, it was generally regarded as, the former Freiman place. So it almost suggests sometime in 1894 is actually when Freiman left his restaurant. But by his story, he left for Hawaii in 1892. And he even tells this story about a Chinese man that it was generally known around town as Baby, I guess just because he was just very youthful in appearance, this individual had been Freeman's servant off and on over the years. And according to Freeman, he had saved Baby's life a few times, including one instance where there was an underground Chinese organization who their members were chasing after Baby literally with hatchets, and Baby had to take seclusion in the basement of Freiman's restaurant to be saved. And according to Bernard Freeman, who makes this claim that he developed connections with so many prominent Portlanders. I previously mentioned William S. Ladd, Henry Failing, Harvey Whitefield Scott. He also claimed to have connections with Philip Markham, Van de Lashmet, future Portland mayor, among others. And yet, when he caught a steamer headed out of Portland, ultimately leading to him going to Hawaii, he claimed that Baby was the only person who showed up and waved goodbye to him. So, it's interesting. I don't know what that section is supposed to mean, and even Freeman mentions he would have figured there would have been more people there to see him off, but there wasn't. Either way, he claims he goes to Hawaii, and he's there during the transition of the government, the Queen there being dethroned, and he claimed that he was part of a militia there, and he even claimed that he met the Queen once, and the Queen, like everybody else in the world, somehow the Queen just knows everything about Bernard Freeman's past, and she claimed when she met him, don't believe everything this man says, essentially. Ben Freeman, because I'm saying Ben Freeman because there were times in the book where people call him Ben Freeman. So I don't know. Maybe he also went by Benjamin. I really don't know. But that is a frequent thing in the book. She said, don't trust Ben Freeman. He could legitimately make you believe that the moon was made out of cheese. It's very interesting, considering our present circumstances, me here talking about this insane story about a man that just fell into my lap because I stumbled onto an article that I knew was about a man who was tied to an old building in Portland that I've seen a time or two. A story that is full of things that we don't know whether or not we should believe them or not. So he's also met the Queen of Hawaii, and again, he claims to have been associated with Sanford Dole, who was chosen by the provisional government in 1893 to become the president of Hawaii, replacing the Queen. And then he was chosen to be president again in 1894 up until 1898. In 1898 is when Hawaii was officially annexed by the United States as a territory. So Dole was the only president that ever existed for Hawaii during that transitional period. And what's interesting is this transition, Freeman claims to have been directly involved, like he was feeding them information, and Marines were called in. U.S. Marines were called in to have the back of those who essentially dethroned the queen and put in this replacement government. And this was all done without, let's say, approval from the United States government. And Grover Cleveland became the president. And Grover Cleveland pressured them to cut this nonsense and to actually put the queen back into her position and have things go back to the way they were before. And this provisional government that was put into place, they pretty much said, screw you, Mr. Cleveland, no offense, but we're sticking to this. And even throughout the portions you read about Freeman being in Hawaii and being directly involved in this upheaval in Hawaii, he makes references here and there that clearly show that he was in favor of this transition. He refers to the queen as being extremely dangerous and violent. And he even makes mention that a lot of the locals, and this is before the government shifted, he said that many of the natives and locals there actually were in support of Hawaii being annexed to the United States. Now, again, that's just Bernard Freeman's words, but he makes these subtle references that show that he was on the side that was putting the provisional government in place to replace the old one. I mean, beyond the fact that he was literally giving them information. Things got pretty hot in Hawaii, and there was a lot of backlash after this. And the funny thing is, right in the middle of all of this, one of the reasons that Bernard Freeman went to Hawaii was he took over running a hotel. Now, in addition to that, he had a bunch of bungalows in near Waikiki Beach. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. And he claimed that in 1893, again at a time where he may or may not have still been in Portland, he claimed that Robert Louis Stevenson came and stayed in one of his bungalows for a couple of months, and that they got used to seeing each other every day and conversed with each other. And kind of like the Rudyard Kipling story, they managed to find connections with each other in terms of places they'd been and experiences that they'd had. They managed to really connect well in terms of numerous different places they'd been to across the world, wherein once they were there, they ended up totally broke. That was something that they were able to connect with each other on. Finally, come 1895, Freeman departs on a steamer, leaving Hawaii after anywhere from 1 to 3 years. And he starts a long trip with the objective of ending up in Australia. However, he ended up in New Zealand first. And he knew that New Zealand was fertile grounds for oil, and that in recent years, numerous oil fields had been established in New Zealand. Some claim that New Zealand had probably the best untapped, I don't know oil terminology, but there was a lot of oil to be obtained. A lot of oil already had been obtained, but there were a lot of places that hadn't been tapped into yet. And here we have Bernard Freeman moving on to his next place, and he wanted to get involved in this oil game. So he starts getting in with some locals there, which includes a colonel and a man that he only describes as a Scottish man named McPherson. And they start making a little bit of progress. At least that's what it seems. That's what seems to be happening. And they're making so much progress that McPherson comes in and says, Standard Oil is interested in what we've got going on. And that's a big deal, Standard Oil. And McPherson gets called away. He's got to go to San Francisco. He's got to go on this long ship ride to San Francisco and have a meeting with the Standard guys. So everyone's excited. This could end up being a bigger thing than they even thought at the start. And then the ship that McPherson is on arrives in San Francisco, but he's not on it. Nobody knows what happened to him. And it becomes pretty clear to Freeman and everybody involved that McPherson just took all of their money and ran, and the whole thing was a scam. And even Freeman called it one of the most elaborate and artistic swindles that had ever been done on him. And he said, I've been around, I've been scammed before, but this one was particularly impressive because nobody saw it coming. And this guy just left New Zealand with their money and, as far as they know, wasn't seen again. At least they don't know what happened to him. So broke, Bernard Freeman has to find somewhere else to go. Well, he was already planning on going to Australia, and he's in New Zealand. Like, Australia's right over there. So he sticks with that, and he goes to Australia, lands in Sydney, and he's trying to think of his next thing to get into. And he hears that there's a lot of gold potential off in the Queensland portion of Australia. So he starts looking into that a little bit. Maybe he can get into the gold mining game. But it's not something he's very experienced in. So he's learning about it. He's reading up a little bit about it. But he puts out a notice saying that he wants an expert in this field to come and work with him. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this built Frenchman named Louis de Rougemont. That's what I would think his name would sound like in French. Louis de Rougemont. See, I can't even hold it together. Comes in. And in his strong French accent, because anybody who has an accent in this book, he writes their dialogue in their accent. He comes in and says, I'm the man for you. I'm the man you want. You want gold? I can show you where there's fields of gold. Hasn't been touched. But he's got to accompany Freeman there because Louis de Rougemont is not just Louis de Rougemont. He introduces himself as Louis de Rougemont, the king of the cannibals, essentially of the Northern Territory in Australia. He calls himself the king of the cannibals, and he wants to lead Bernard Freeman into the unknown land of Australia, the land where very few people are there. And most people probably don't want to go there unless they absolutely have to. The land of the cannibals is essentially how it's being presented. And Benjamin Freeman, when all is said and done, he really likes Louis and feels like he's very trustworthy, and there's something about him. He agrees to go with him. And they spend like a year wandering around the rurals of Australia. Again, you have to wonder whether this really happened or not. And Louis is telling him all of these stories of all the wild experiences he's had and all the animals he's had encounters with. And there's stories that just make your skin crawl, like their encounter with these tarantulas that hide in the sand. And I'm just like, no, not me. And pretty much Louis had to, he talked Freeman into doing this. He had to be his guardian. Bernard Freeman referenced at least one time where he was attacked by cannibals, and Louis had to come in and save him at the last minute. And there would be times where they would, wherever they were settled, they would see these people around them, and it was clear that they were just desiring to eat them. So long and the short of it, and when they would sometimes come running at them, Louis would just stand up with a shotgun and scare them off. Freeman even referenced at one time seeing some of these cannibals get their hands on someone and described it as this like maniacal orgy that happened while they were also eating someone. And Freeman said, he was so shaken up, it was such a nightmarish thing to witness that he didn't sleep. He just didn't sleep for like a couple days. He was so horrified by it. And survived this experience literally by the skin of his teeth. But the unfortunate thing is, for all this travel, they weren't really finding any gold. And what he did find was, it was the kind of gold that you would need heavy equipment to move it out, and they just didn't have that equipment, and it would have taken forever for that to happen. And he just kind of, I think, got burnt out on the whole thing. It seemed like he was, the more time passed, the more he was realizing this is not really what I'm into. Maybe it's time to move on to the next thing. And he's about 43 years old at this time. He's by no means old. He's not that much older than I am right now, but you're getting to that point where time is becoming less in your life, and you're maybe becoming a little bit more fickle about the experiences you want. If he was going to go out to sea again, maybe instead of being at sea for 3 years, he might only do it for one before realizing, I ain't got time for this anymore. And so that was another venture that he supposedly went on, the gold search in the land of the cannibals, that ultimately didn't really lead to anything. So, financially speaking, he was, not broke by any means, but he certainly wasn't where he had been at previously. And it's interesting, at this point, there is a shift in the book that Freeman wrote, because at this point we're approaching the 1900s. With the book being written in 1933, I mean, we still have like 35 plus years of this man's life left, and by the time he left Australia around 1899, 1900, the book is almost done, and there's actually not a whole lot more discussed. He kind of leapfrogs from around 1900 to 1918, and there's like almost 20 years of his life that he doesn't talk about. And something else he doesn't really talk about is his marriage, or rather marriages, because there's a whole marriage he had that he doesn't even reference in this book. He mentions getting married in 1899, and even that marriage he doesn't really talk a lot about. He just is kind of like, all right, I got married, I left Australia. He then moved to London for a couple of years, and he continued to travel around, and sometimes my wife came with me on those trips. That's about all he had to say about his wife. But he married a woman named Annette previously, and we know this because of some drama that arose in 1901 that is directly tied to this first wife, and is also directly tied to Freeman in terms of the fact that he wrote a letter discussing his past with this first wife. All information that never showed up in his book. So come February 1901, in California, a man named Joseph Maristani, assuming that's how it's pronounced, he wants his marriage with his wife Annette annulled because he has recently gained information that suggests that his wife had never gotten a divorce from her previous husband and thus was a bigamist, and also she had lied to him because when they met she claimed that her husband, who was living in Australia, had been murdered by this man known as Butler, who apparently was just a serial killer roaming around Australia killing people, and her husband happened to be one of his victims. Now, you've probably connected the dots. This Annette is the same Annette who married Bernard Freeman previously. So this trial starts, or this court proceeding starts going on, because after getting married, Maristani had given all of this money and property and stuff to this woman that he assumed was his faithful wife, and now he wanted it back. And unfortunately, by later accounts, it seems like she just kind of got away with this, which is really strange, because not only was Maristani's account, or his side, namely that her husband wasn't dead, accurate, but Bernard Freeman sent him a letter saying, I will tell you whatever you want to know about this lunatic you married, because I was married to her previously and I could tell right away she was no good, and I pretty much broke free from her as quickly as possible. Now, perhaps one of the reasons that Bernard Freeman didn't mention this first wife in his book may have something to do with her story in terms of their marriage, which is that she married Bernard Freimann. See, I just did Freiman. Bernard Freeman in Portland in 1893, and he was running a restaurant. Again, we have a claim that suggests he had not gone off to Hawaii in 1892. Maybe that played a part in it. Maybe just the marriage was so crappy that Freeman didn't want to waste pages in his book on it. But by his first wife Annette's claim, he took off, went to Hawaii. She even claims that she went with him, and yet she goes completely unmentioned in that too. And even then, by that account, it suggests he went to Hawaii later than he claimed. And pretty much he went off to Australia, and she claims the last she heard from him was 1895, got news that this guy had killed him. So when she met Maristani, she was under the impression that he was dead, so therefore she didn't do anything wrong. Maybe the court validated that she had a reason to believe he was dead, that she in good faith thought he was, and so she got away with it in terms of Maristani, who Bernard Freeman wanted to help every way he could. He was like, if I ever encounter her again, I will gladly turn her over to the authorities. He claimed that she even went out and visited him when all of this drama was going on, and she was in danger of, God forbid, losing this stuff that she shouldn't have been entitled to with a man she shouldn't have been married to in the first place. She tracked down Bernard Freeman in London and tried to get him to play along with this, to act like he was dead so that he wouldn't be uncovered. And of course, he was like, go to hell, I'm not going to help you with this. You were a terrible first wife, I have no interest in helping you. And unfortunately, the whole thing left Joseph Maristani broke. He'd been a fairly well-to-do guy, and this was kind of the beginning of his downfall. And he ended up passing away from heart disease in 1905. And even before his death, Bernard Freeman tried to connect with him, at least to some degree, because he sympathized with this man. They'd both endured similar experiences with the same woman. And, Bernard Freeman was younger than Maristani at this time, or at least when he was married to Annette. And he was able to, he had that drive to move on and go to the next thing. He wasn't going to be taken down by that, even if he was broke. And clearly Joseph Maristani just didn't have that same drive in him. And he was already in his early 60s when this happened, and I think he was kind of a broken down man at the end, unfortunately. But again, that story, that whole 1901 drama, goes unmentioned in Bernard Freeman's book because he leaps from 1900 all the way to 1918. In the last chapter of Freeman's book, he discusses how in 1925 he became an ambassador of peace between Constantinople and Australia. And he leaves it off at that, even though he still had another 8 years to cover. But I'm wondering if maybe he did that intentionally because he would ultimately pass away while living in Australia. And the last little blip, there's like one more little paragraph after this last chapter where he says, as of this writing, before this will even be published to you, I'll be back at sea returning to Australia. So as an 81-year-old man, which he states directly in this final little piece, it seems like he planned to just go back to Australia and live out his final years there. So I think having this final chapter be primarily about him having this connection between Constantinople and Australia, there's kind of a correlation there between his birthplace and what would prove to be his final resting place. And Australia would end up being his final resting place, as that's where he's buried. So that's what I think about his final chapter. Again, most of the book only covers from 1852 to around 1900, going into the 1900s. But the last 30 years of his life, the last several years aren't discussed at all, and there's only 2 chapters, both of which focus in on only one particular period of time. So it was very much focused on his earlier years, and if he was Not being completely honest, exaggerating certain things here and there, perhaps putting himself in places where he never actually was. He may have thought, as we get closer to present day, that being 1933, that it might be a little bit easier for people to look into it and determine whether he was telling the truth or not. And if you can disprove a bunch of elements rather easily from this book, then the whole thing falls apart, because even with things that you can't prove or disprove, people are going to be suspicious about the whole thing. So the book definitely, I think, benefited from the fact that most of the people discussed that he had met or known were long gone by 1933. I think the fact that he waited till then to write it was to his benefit. It also, I mean, this was not like a New York Times bestseller. I fortunately was able to stumble onto a copy of it because I was like, well, I can't do this video if I can't find a copy of his book. And when I found it, I sat down and in 2 really long sessions read all through it and took notes on it and pretty much got down this guy's whole life story. And it's definitely, at least as far as I've gathered, kind of just one of those forgotten memoirs of the past. Certainly not something people really talk about. Nobody really talks about Bernard Freimann at all. I mean, when I looked into him, pretty much all I could find was newspaper articles. And then I stumbled onto this book that told me so much more. But even with this book and this story about this man that was involved in so many things and was tied to so many significant events and even these wild personal adventures, and yet nobody has really even talked about him since. I couldn't really find any articles about him after 1933. The only ones I found that did reference him were just in reference to his Portland restaurant. And even in that case, they would just be like, oh, this is the restaurant that Bernard Freeman once ran. The building was originally his restaurant. It really doesn't go any further than that. So that certainly lends credence to the idea that he was exaggerating a lot of what he said in this story, which I fully believe, but it's just too wild of a story not to tell. And because he's so forgotten and his book is so really not well known, this is not a story that I think gets around a lot. I don't think, maybe somebody has talked about this on YouTube, but somehow I doubt it. I feel like I would have found it personally. And so that's the story of Bernhard Freimann, Bernard Freeman, Ben Freeman, however you want to put it. And just something interesting. I wanted to save this for the end. Something I stumbled onto. It's just funny. It's just one of those funny things where all these little things sync right up. So Bernard Freeman was obviously originally born Bernhard Freimann. Now, there is another, still around, famous restaurant. If you're a local, maybe you've heard of it. Jake's Famous Crawfish. That place was originally founded by a man named Jacob Freimann. Freimann and Freimann. The difference between the way their last names were spelled was one N. Bernard Freeman had 2 N's. Jacob Freimann only had 1. That was the only difference. And they both established very prominent restaurants in Portland specifically. And beyond that, the deaths of these 2 men were separated by only 5 days. Jacob Freimann passed away on October 7th, 1933. And Bernard Freeman passed away October 2nd, 1933. So I just couldn't leave that little nugget of information unreferenced in this video, especially in relation to a restaurant that Portlanders, young and old, all recognize, whether they've eaten there or not. And that, my friends, is the story of Bernard Freeman, at least as he tells it. With the Christmas season upon us, I've been extremely busy both at my day job and in my social life, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to get a really intensive, detailed video done this week, even though I have a few lined up. And after stumbling onto just a sprinkling of this man's story, and that he may have had a lot more to his life outside of just this little restaurant in Portland, which when I first stumbled onto his name, I figured that was probably about as interesting as his life got. He just owned a popular restaurant in Portland. While I've openly, responsibly acknowledged I by no means take this guy's writings at face value, it's still a very interesting read, and I think it's a story worth being told. It's still the product of a man's life and how he chose to portray it to the world. And so that is still a story worth telling, with the asterisk along with it that believe what you will, research what you want. And I think what we have here is simply the story of a man who I think definitely had an interesting life, and probably embellished a little bit. But, I mean, there are certain things we can verify. We can verify that he was born in Constantinople. We know that he visited all of these places he went to. Whether or not something wild and amazing happened everywhere he went, that is where the questions arise. But we know he died in Australia. We know he lived in Portland. We know he was in San Francisco. Most of the places he went to, we can verify that he was there. Just what exactly happened while he was there, we can't say for certain. But it's something I really wanted to cover, and now I'm glad I did, even though it ain't easy. I knew if I was going to do a video on this, I was going to have to do it right after taking the notes, because look at how many... These are the notes. This is all the stuff I had to remember for this video. Fortunately, I have pretty good recall up to about 3 or 4 days after I do all this note-taking stuff. So I've just spent the last 2 days just binging reading the book and the other resources and taking notes. And then I knew today I was going to want to sit down and do this while the information was still fresh in my mind. And that's how it happened. Anyway, all that said, thank you so much for being here, watching this very no-frills video. I actually asked for quite a few things that would particularly help a setup such as this, where I'm doing a video, at home, more talking to you outside of the more I want to say democratic, the documentarian. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm getting tired. The documentarian style that I usually do. So I'm looking forward to having a slightly better setup for when I do videos like this after Christmas. So you can look forward to that when I do videos like this. All of that said, thank you so much for being here. If you want to help out my channel, remember to like, share, subscribe. I have my Patreon in the link with the description to this video if you want to help me out there. I'm trying to get that to keep growing and keep kind of growing outside of just YouTube, making money through YouTube ads and things like that, which forces you to take in a bunch of ads, which, I hate that that's a necessary evil, but at this time it is a necessary evil for me. And so yeah, my Patreon is there. I'm still trying to get new content up there and get my podcast thing going again. I've just been insanely busy, implying that I've been working on this for months or so. Look at my hair. I'm obviously losing my mind. But anyway, I'm going to try to keep up any pieces I put together for there. That's a horrible way to put that sentence together. But again, getting back to my podcast, posting previously unreleased content, some new content when I'm back out exploring around. We've been having a lot of unpredictable weather that's made that kind of hard, and obviously the Christmas season's doing that too. But anyway, I'm rambling because I'm a little incoherent at this point. Just want to say one more time, thank you so much for stopping by. Hope you enjoyed this interesting little piece of not just Portland history, but kind of history that hits all over the place. That said, till next time, this has been Steve the Historian.